Good morning. It's really great to be here. I got a nice, good night's rest, so I hope I'll be clear and inspiring to you all. I want to start off and tell you a little bit about greetings in relation to where I come from. They are an opportunity to recognize our shared humanity and to basically communicate honor and respect. In greeting one another, it's customary for us to bring our palms together and bow slightly to the other person. Reflected in this gesture is a heartfelt expression of humility, meant to establish a mutual understanding that we are at once both small and powerful. It communicates the sentiment that we are all connected, not only to one another, but to generations of ancestors who came before us, and ultimately to the land. It says quite simply, I am committed to our ancestral and land connections, and I am committed to you. So this morning, let me bow to you and recognize that I am committed to our ancestral and land connections, and I am committed to you. When David and Tess first told me how the seeds of this conference were first sown in Glasgow, I was blown away. Not necessarily by the pub outing, but I was really inspired by their story. I have a wallet at home literally filled with hundreds of cards from people I've met at conferences, accompanied by promises to get together, to stay in touch, along with, I believe, sincere intentions to explore what might have been possible together that would not have been possible alone. But yet, in spite of these best intentions, those next action steps never really happened. And although these conferences are purposefully designed to promote collaboration, I have to confess the typical outcome for me has simply been a robust card collection whose presence is an ever-pervasive reminder of dynamic energy that is long dissipated and possibilities unrealized. On the other hand, the initial connections that have led to ongoing participation and development of meaningful and authentic work have often come from local level or community-driven venues, convened around an important issue by people who live in the consequences of those issues every day, where traditional boundaries are redrawn, roles and expectations are transformed, and where experts and leaders learn to follow in order to lead. I've given a lot of thought to why this might be the case. What brings people together? Why do they stay together? What drives them to commit, to lead, or even to follow? How do we mobilize our efforts and leverage our diversity to organize around what's most important? What keeps people from seeing what is most important? And how do we find and support the efforts of those who seem to understand this and are working intentionally towards it and socially impactful outcomes? These are some of the questions that I hope you'll be asking yourselves over the next few days while we are together, and these are the very questions that I actually hope together we can learn from one another to answer. So to this end, I feel like there's a lot that we can learn from David and Tess, Minnie, Mary Jane, and John's experience in Glasgow, and I want to take this opportunity to highlight 3 elements that resonated for me. My goal in doing this is to offer some clarity about what I believe is the impact of community and place on our identities. I think if we can understand the impact community and place have on our identities, our sense of self, our sense of worth, and our own wholeness, we have a better chance of designing generative, inclusive, and thriving communities. So in this process, I'll share with you some of my own stories about self and community, not as a means to highlight the right way to do something or how things should be done, but rather as a way to illustrate the interdependencies between community, place, and identity, and hopefully to provoke you to think deeply and intentionally about that as you design in your own work. I want to talk with you today about Heinz Kohut, a psychologist who developed the body of work we refer to as self-psychology. He believed, as Mary Poppins would say, that we were born practically perfect in every way. To Kohut, we were born whole, intact, beautiful, and ready. The primary challenge that we faced, he believed, was that we were born dependent on others, unable at that point to fend for ourselves. And his thinking at the time was totally disruptive and a stark contrast to the prevailing school of thought that we are by nature born unruly, aggressive, and untamed, motivated by an unconscious or a relentless drive to seek pleasure and avoid pain. So for Kohut, preserving our wholeness, growing, and living to our greatest potential was our primary motivation. To this end, he hypothesized the existence of 3 universal needs that we all have as humans. And these needs had to be met by the world around us in order for us to actualize towards our greatest potential and our best selves. So the first of these is a need that he referred to as our grandiose identity, our need to be a superstar. The second was a need that he believed we had to connect to others, to trust and to look up to others, to actually believe and see in the power of goodness in others. And then the final need, he felt, was a universal need that we each have to belong, to be able to see ourselves as part of a collective, and he called this twinship. Associated with these 3 universal needs were corresponding functions that the world around us must provide. So to promote our need to be a superstar, to believe in our fullest and be our best self, the world around us had to mirror or reflect our own capacity back to us, basically show us what we can become. This enabled, he believed, ambition and creativity. To promote our need for connection, he felt that the world around us needed to be trustworthy, reliable, and good, which empowered our hope and our risk-taking. And finally, to experience a sense of twinship or belonging, it was imperative that we could see ourselves in the world. The world around us had to make room for us, fit us in, and this generated compassion and ethics. Now for Kohut, the world around us referred to people and things with which we have relationships. And for me, that latter proposition, the notion that things, objects, places, ideas, are tangible, not just symbolic things, tangible things with which we have direct relationships, and therefore, by their very own nature, exert a direct influence on our own sense of wellness, was very compelling. It was compelling to me because it was the first time that I studied Western psychology or philosophy and felt a cultural relevance and salience to those ideas. In my own country of origin, Vietnam, identity is rooted not only to generations of ancestors, as I indicated earlier, but also to the land. In our millennia-old customs, we honor and engage ancestors who have already passed. We make regular offerings to family, altars of fruit, tea cakes, paper money, and incense sticks to bless their life beyond earth so they may bless and protect our life on earth. The elements of nature and water and earth, like water, fire, wind, metal, and wood, are not just a collection of compound molecules mined for resources, but contain within them spirit guardians, such that they serve as protectors and punishers, holding us accountable to our ancestral legacies. We bury the umbilical cords of our newborn babies in the land, in spots that are selected through tea leaf readings in accordance with the interpretation of village elders and wise fortune tellers, peers who are highly regarded and respected for their deep connections to the spirit world and their knowledge of the medicinal powers of botanical plants. These burials symbolize our understanding of these relationships and serves to ensure that our lives are intertwined with the forces of nature and ultimately symbolize that we will always have a place in the world, somewhere to belong. So you can imagine the psychological massacre that took place when Saigon fell to communist forces on April 30th, 1975, the day my family and I fled the land, our land, all those umbilical cords left behind, a diaspora of refugees exiled and lost at sea, literally nearly 3 million Vietnamese when all was said and done. Not only were we then without a home and without a country, we had done the unthinkable. We left the land. We cut our ties to those cords, and therefore we belonged nowhere. By the time my family and I arrived, following transport through 2 refugee camps to the United States, domestic policy for the newest wave of refugees was intentionally designed to focus singularly and strictly on assimilation. The explicit design of that was codified in immigrant policies that required U.S. settlement agencies to follow specific placement guidelines, including exact distances in miles any two families could be placed together or near one another, regardless of their blood relations. There are also legal expectations about the transfer of our names. Tien Ung, the name given to me by my mother, which meant water fairy or water goddess, along with Nia, the nickname adorned to me by my beloved maternal grandmother, which meant to live with humility and grace, were edited out of our family stories and replaced with American names. For our protection, the policy read. My American name was Daffodil, given to me by a mother who herself was only 24 years old at the time in a country with 3 children and no English fluency. And while daffodils are certainly the first sign of spring, captured in the compelling poetry of Robert Frost among many other things, it was to me, then and now, a far cry from water goddess who lives with humility and grace. Come on, which would you want? Seriously. Essentially, the expectation that was mirrored to me from my new community and place were that we were finally relocated, but everything that we were, everything that was important to my family, had to be stripped. So that if I wanted to be that superstar, I had to become American. Stated differently, there was no place for us to belong in our new home without radical changes to the very core of who we knew ourselves to be. And while the core of the policies were designed so we could assimilate more easily into the culture of the US, presumably to prevent our own alienation in a country that was apparently quite ambivalent about its role as host, fundamentally, these policies were also designed to ensure our economic independence, or rather, to avoid our fiscal dependence on the US welfare state. So again, community in place sends a clear and loud message about who we could be and who we were as newly minted war and political refugees without a home. What they were not designed to do was to leverage our different ways of knowing or doing, our strengths, our capabilities, our hope, our creativity. This became ever so apparent for me in my own struggles on the front lines of the child protection system, where I started my own career as a social work practitioner and where I served for nearly a decade. As a result of my racial status, I was assigned to all the Asian families in my particular office's catchment area. And it was irrelevant that the languages I spoke were Vietnamese, Italian, and English. The predominant design at this point involved racial matching, which was a mechanism to promote culturally responsive practice. So if there was a Chinese family, I was their worker, even if I didn't speak Chinese. If there was a Korean family, I was assigned to that case as well, even though I didn't speak Korean either, and so on and so forth. But since my new identity in America was organized around this vision of me assimilating into the world around me, it was no surprise that my work in the context of child protection would primarily evolve around translating. So I became the best American translator. I translated to the people of my race, and when possible, in my own indigenous language, what it meant to be Asian in America. In other words, what the expectations were around family functioning, family social interactions, child rearing, couples relationships, among other things. In this very hard work, it became clear to me that the framework of the child welfare system organized itself around the language of culpability under the notion of protection, producing a syntax composed of victims and perpetrators. Victims and perpetrators was, though, to me, a very limiting way of viewing family functioning, child well-being, and produced really poor possibilities and limited conceptions about what healthy is or could mean, especially in relation to the children and families with whom I worked. In this world, they were all victims and they were all perpetrators. Sure, they did not always make the decisions that were easily understood by mainstream culture, and sure, some of them were gang involved and also violent. However, embedded in their ways were also age-old traditions that reflected the best of my cultural ancestry: honor, respect, personal duty, collective responsibility, for example. Yet these aspects of their identity, of their very being, were not reflected in the policies that defined child protection, nor was it reflected in the poor living conditions and the ethnic enclaves, the neighborhoods and the communities and the places under which they could afford to live, until they made it to the American middle class, and therefore to the American suburbs. But even there, meaning in this new location and in that new place, it was clear that who they had to be in order to get to where they were was about becoming more American rather than becoming a Vietnamese living in America. Relocation to a different place of living was a symbol of status, not a place to be at home. For the rest of them, they remained where they were, unable to push through the social and fiscal ceilings established by immigration policies and regulations that limited their access to education and earning potential. There was no community for this land of no nation states people, and no place where they could belong. So essentially, the continuum was built. Asians in America, or at least Vietnamese in America, were either epic success stories or epic failures. I never knew how to make any meaning or sense out of that. When I was 9 years old, I won the spelling bee championship for my grade level. 2 years after that, at 11 years old, I cheated on a spelling test. On the morning that I was caught cheating, I was appropriately sent to the principal's office. Once there, it was reflected to me that I was a big disappointment, that people were counting on me to make something of myself, given my family's humble beginnings in the US, and given that I had been a star student up to that point, well-behaved, hardworking. I was reminded that 2 years prior I had won the spelling bee, so there really was no excuse for my current circumstances. It was made clear that I run the risk of moving backwards and not forward, and that this was a slippery slope, and I had best be mindful of it, lest I slip even further down that slope. My hands were then hit with a paddle. And yes, paddling in school still existed then. And no, I am not that old. The point of my story is that there was no other possible narrative to explain my cheating to the teacher and principal, who up until that point could only value me as a poor refugee girl who was going to make the best American dream success story if I could just keep it together and be the one version of me who they could see, which had more to do with who they wanted me to be and expected me to be than who I was capable of becoming. What they could not see, nor did they care to ask, was why had I cheated? Had they done that, I would have shared with them the night before, that particular school day, my father had taken his own life, unable to heal from the experience of cutting that cord so many years previously, tortured by the challenges of living in the US as an invisible person, unmirrored, unreminded of the trust and availability of others in the community, and without a place where he could see himself in others. I would have told them that I had not slept and had not had a chance to study. I would have explained that as a family, we were supposed to do, and we were used to doing what we were told to do for fear of being exiled or sent back from the only land we had left. Psychological beliefs validated by external policies, full of contingencies related to our belonging, how we could belong, and where we would belong. So my mother sent me to school, not wanting to break the rules and keep me home. These themes of assimilation, absence of community, invisibility were to be replicated again and again no matter where we moved. They seemed to follow me everywhere as an emerging adult and then even later as a graduate student. In graduate school, for example, I did not learn about the ways in which Vietnamese people conceptualize mental health or wellness, like the importance of balance and harmony in all relationships. only that the Vietnamese were poor service utilizers, resistant to treatment, and held far-fetched beliefs about spirits and animal guides and ancestral heritage. I also did not know much about the ways in which families and communities could come together to support one another through violence, poverty, and hardship, only that the Vietnamese were violent, gang-involved, and resistant to conform to new customs and cultural norms. While I did not realize it at that time, years later, as my work continued to evolve, I began to see the futility in designing around individuals, that essentially questions about individuals themselves were not the most important, though it did make it easy to codify people's behavior and to nurture, I think, a very unrealistic belief that I could predict as well as we, or prevent behaviors or things from happening. But in the end, very little in risk management design models enable me or enable us to cultivate the best of who we are. What did empower people and me to get to the best was by shifting the question and shifting the focus, essentially shifting the paradigm altogether. I began to recognize the importance of designing for capacity, for diversity, for community engagement, and for ownership. I began to understand that we cannot talk about child maltreatment and family violence without talking about trauma, poverty, racism, oppression, and systemic interactions. It became evident that the questions focused on profiling individuals as victims or perpetrators would not yield as much value in terms of design and innovation as questions about what conditions led individuals to their particular situation. During my first Skype conference with David and Tess to explore the possibility of my joining this community momentum, David explained of the Glasgow Pub Convention, and he said, "We Kiwis have a way of finding one another no matter where we are in the world." As a person who lived all of my childhood and most of my adult life in exile in the United States until embargoes were lifted from Vietnam and relations between the countries began to emerge, the idea that home can be anywhere because it lives in the hearts and the minds of the people of the land and their collective intentions literally brought me to my knees. So while a remarkable part of their story is certainly reflected in their own self-organization and the leveraging of their diversity for a common purpose, which has led us to gather here today, the most compelling part for me was the reminder that through intentional collective design, we can serve those three universal needs of human wholeness: the need to be seen, to believe in the power of the goodness of others, and to belong, and in so doing, enable and promote full capacity living. It made me think, gee, how much do we miss on a daily basis when we don't intentionally promote or design to the organic adaptiveness and resilience of our human nature? When we forget to promote diversity, when we view others who are differently abled through the lens of charity, or even worse, through pity, rather than through the lens of universality, we miss out. What's worse, we have no idea what we will become if we continue to design around people's most vulnerable moments, their worst choices, and what they can't do, rather than their capacities, their most remarkable adaptations, and their biggest hopes. I have observed and come to the conclusion, whether rightly or wrongly, that transformative change, the type that is associated with leading-edge innovation, comes from believing in the impossible, doing the unexpected, and embracing failure. How many times have you heard someone at a round table discussion share a really exciting or extraordinary idea, only for the conversation to immediately shift to a question of feasibility? How many times have you wondered whether your particularly creative idea is actually smart enough? There's something extraordinary that's possible when we are given permission to step to the left side of our logical thinking brains, or to the left side of our logical thinking identities, where we're attached to our expert selves and our professional identities. I believe that if we did this more often, That if we allowed our independent and professional selves to be smaller while our collective selves grew larger, and in fellowship, we might have a better chance at consistently designing for breakthrough outcomes, to design to what matters, and in so doing, to discover all that is possible, not just everything that is reasonable. Some of us by design here today had to be small or to be made small in order to realize how big we actually are. I stubbornly hang on to the belief that if we gathered the world's best, the musician, the economist, the environmentalist, the conservationist, the computer scientist, the chemist, the physicist, along with the world's most vulnerable and resilient, the child abuse survivor, the formerly incarcerated, the single mother, the single father, the child at risk, the differently abled, and sat them around the same table, placing at the center of that table our most complex problems, health disparities, violence, poverty, and child hunger, and said, here, this is the best science on this topic. What do you think is most important, and what would you do next and why? I believe that if we essentially removed the boundaries that impede people's capacity to believe they have something worthwhile to contribute to conversations that affect humanity as a whole, then we may have a chance at scaling discoveries and breakthrough innovations. Too often, people learn about the major problems we face as a society today, about police violence, racial hate crimes, educational and health disparities, and say or think, hey, that's a really terrible problem, and I really feel badly about it, but I'm just a pianist or an economist or a computer scientist. I think you'll have to go and talk to the experts about this. But I think if we dare to remove those barriers and said in return, nonsense, we all have experience transforming complex problems because we've transformed our own lives. There's something you know that can help us think differently about this issue. So tell us, what do you think about harmonious living in the context of diversity through the lens of music? Or perhaps, how would you change violent energy and transform it through the lens of physics? On the intersections of community, place, and identity, renowned sociologist Sarup reminds us, we apprehend identity not in the abstract, but always in relation to a given place and time. Identity is changed by the journey, our subjectivity recomposed. In the transformation, every step forward can also be a step back. The migrant is here and there. Exile can be deadening, but it can also be very creative. It can be an affliction, but it can also be a transfiguration. It can be a resource. Identity is not to do with being, but with becoming. He reminds us that transcending boundaries enables our capacity to see what is possible. Within boundaries, we assume only the identities that are sanctioned, deemed valid and worthy by somebody. Across boundaries, we can become anything. Our professional identities are confined by these boundaries and therefore take a very static and depersonalized form that's unrealistic, unidimensional. We depress all aspects and dimensions of ourselves to become the professional, almost machine-like and data-driven, robotic, if you will, in human form. And it is from this robotic place that we unfortunately most often design and engage. In a linear world that we don't choose to fight, we're used to believing that when we make a choice, it's at the expense of other alternatives, perpetuating the driving assumption that one thing leads to another, and therefore one pathway, one primary solution that's to be adapted and accommodated for everybody else. But if we pushed, like I'm asking you to push today, and like you've come here to push together, to the position that we are actually all interconnected, so that when you make one choice, you are choosing all the alternatives simultaneously, what can happen to our sense of design and to our sense of what is possible? I implore you to consider this over the next few days. Do you transcend boundaries in how you think, engage, and work? I will leave you now with the wise words of Nobel laureate Tagore in order to join you and learn with you. I slept, and dreamt that life was joy. I awoke and found that life was duty. I acted, and behold, duty was joy. Namaste.